Okay, so I'm back. Let's try to see if we can start to wrap this up here. Now, as you can see, here's my attribute editor for the skin shader. What I'm going to do is start plugging in maps, texture maps, color maps, and even a bump map to get this thing to look the way it's supposed to. Okay, so let's open up the Hypershade here. And here's our jellyfish. We're going to be creating a pretty large network here with all the maps we have to plug in. Let's minimize that Hypershade. And okay, let's start to plug some of this stuff in. Now, I have a texture map that I created, and I want to plug that texture map into the overall diffuse color layers over here. So what I'm going to do is go to the overall color, and in my case, I'm going to plug in an overall color here. So I'm just going to click on the checkerboard icon there. Now I'm going to go to File. Okay, then I'm going to go look for a map here, and the map that I'm looking for is going to be, let's see where I can find it here. It's going to be here in this jellyfish folder here. You want to go ahead and look for a jellyfish color. So let's grab that one. Let's plug it in. Update the texture sample up here. Okay, if I hit view, this is what I have here. It's a pretty basic texture here. It was done in ZBrush, and you can see here that it's got sort of this yellowish type color to it. Now, your texture can be any color that you want it to be. In this case, I made mine this yellow sort of color here. Okay, so let me close that. And for the filter, I'm just going to go ahead and use a bitmap filter, since that's what I usually like to use. And that's it. Let's click on this button right up here so we can go back to the skin shader. Okay, so the texture is now plugged into the overall color. Now let's go ahead and let's start to do some renders here, some test renders. Let me move this out of the way, open up the render view, and let me just come in here and do render region of this area. Okay, so it took only about 10 seconds. There you can see that now there's a texture here, sort of like these little spots and things. And the texture is now starting to show up. So we're starting to get ourselves a result here. We're starting to get something that's starting to look more like our jellyfish. Okay. Now, to make the texture a bit stronger, I can do a couple of other things, but we'll come back to that later. Right now, let's move on over here to the subsurface scattering layers here. We have different layers. We have 3 different layers. We have the epidermal layer up here. We have the subdermal layer, and we have the backscatter layer over here. Let's start off with the epidermal layer. Now, the epidermal layer is the layer that's on top. Actually, that's not true. The layer that's on top of everything is this diffuse layer, but in terms of subsurface scattering, this is the topmost layer of subsurface scattering, okay? And that's the epidermal layer. So it's on the top of the subsurface scattering layers, which are these 3 right here, and it's actually just beneath the diffuse layer up here, all right? Now, we have a few different parameters. We have a color, we have a weight, and we have a radius, all right? Now, when you have a texture map, you want to plug it into the color slot here. Now, why would you want to plug in a color map to the epidermal scatter layer? Well, the more color maps you have, the more control you can have over the final result of the render here, of the shader. Okay, so right now I have this sort of pink result here from the light that's inside. So I don't want it to look that way. If you remember, my texture was yellow, and this looks pink. That doesn't look right. So what's going on? Well, let's set up these subsurface scattering layers, and we're going to start to see the true final result of the jellyfish start to basically come to light here. Okay, so I'm going to plug in a map here to the epidermal scatter layer. So I'll click on the checkerboard icon, go to File. I'm going to load up an image, and the image that I want to load up for the epidermal layer is conveniently named Jellyfish Epidermal. So let's go ahead and open that up. And if I hit the view button here so I can view this this texture map, you can see that it's totally different. It's not yellow. It's a different map, and this one is sort of like a purplish, pale sort of color here, and there's a reason for that. In this case, making the epidermal layer look like this, almost like something that's dead, sorry for that, but there's no other way to describe it, is the best way for the epidermal layer to work. Because what happens is, if we take the epidermal layer, let's go back and let's click on this icon here so we can go back to the skin shader. If the epidermal scatter color is a warm color, say a color that's reddish or orangish or yellowish, then it's going to make our object here look very, very red and orange, which is not what we want, because the overall texture shows that the jellyfish should be sort of tan, sort of yellowish color. And the problem is, if we leave the epidermal scatter color map as a yellowish or tannish color, then when all this stuff composites on top of each other, we're going to end up with a very reddish orange jellyfish, and it's not going to look the way that we want. And that's why I made the epidermal scatter color that color, a sort of pale blue lavender sort of color. Okay, now let's go ahead and render again and see what we have. Okay, and you can see it still looks pinkish, still looks sort of reddish, didn't change, and that's even with an epidermal scatter color of sort of that bluish color. Okay, don't worry about that. We're going to end up fixing that real soon. Okay, so then we have the epidermal scatter weight as well as the scatter radius. These are very important parameters. The weight controls the strength of this epidermal scatter color. So the higher the weight, the stronger this epidermal scatter color is going to come out in the final render. The lower the weight, the weaker it's going to be, and the less contribution it's going to have for the final render here in the shader. So I'm going to take the weight. I'm actually going to increase that to 1. Okay. Now the scatter radius is actually very important because it determines the area of effect of this shader. So this is the way that it looks now. Let's go ahead and do a render region here. So this is what it looks like with an epidermal scatter weight of 1. Okay. And this is a default scatter radius of 8. So 8 units in a radius for the scatter. We're going to take that scatter radius and we're going to increase that by a lot. So let's go ahead and increase that to 50. And again, these settings are not universal settings. They won't work with every single scene. They will only work with this specific circumstance. So keep that in mind. So I'm going to render again. And it's a little bit hard to tell, but the color map is actually coming out a little bit more, at least the details of the splotching here and stuff like that. But it still looks pinkish, and we're going to end up fixing that. That's because of the backscatter color. We'll get to that. Now let's have a look at the subdermal scatter color, okay, or the subdermal scatter parameters. Again, we have the same set of 3 parameters. We have the color, weight, and a radius. So I actually have a color map for the subdermal scatter layer. So let's go ahead and plug in a color map here. We'll go to File, and we'll switch over here to a Bitmap filter. Let's open this up. And the one that we want to use is, again, conveniently called Jellyfish Subdermal. So let's open that one up. There we go. And if I hit View, this is what I have. My subdermal layer is very, very orange, as you can see here. Okay? And I did that on purpose. Basically because for this circumstance, a very orange, very warm color for the subdermal layer is actually going to work out very well in the end for us here. So let's do a render region here, see what we have. Again, it still looks pretty much the same. So let's change some of these settings over here. Let's take the subdermal scatter weight here. Let's increase that to 1. And you can see it, the subdermal scatter radius is at 25, which is a pretty good setting. But I'm going to go ahead and increase it, make it 50. The same as my epidermal layer, okay, and then we'll do a render region. Okay, you notice that it's still pinkish, but you'll also notice something else, and that is that the subsurface scattering effect is a little bit stronger. You can see that there's more graininess here. It's a little bit more light coming through, especially here in these tentacles that go down here. The reason for that is because we took this radius and made it pretty large. Now, you don't want to make your radius, your scatter radius for any of these layers too large. The problem is that when you increase it, yes, it does add more subsurface scattering, but on the flip side, it actually is going to create some graininess and is going to create this artifacting, which we can actually fix that, and I'll show you how to fix that later when we go over the quality and optimization parameters of this shader. Okay, so let's wrap up this scatter stuff here by adjusting the backscatter parameters. Now the backscatter parameters have a bunch of different settings. Instead of having a color, weight, and radius, this has color, weight, radius, and an extra depth parameter. Okay, I'll talk about that in a moment. Right now, let's go ahead and let's have a look at this. I don't have a color map for this backscatter color. Okay, I'm just going to use the default color here. And what I'm going to do is actually change the color from this red. I don't like this red color being the backscatter color. So let's go ahead and change it. Let's click on it to open up the color chooser. I'm going to switch from HSV to RGB. And you can see it's a pretty deep red. And that actually works good by default for human skin. But for this jellyfish, it's not going to work out. So I'm going to take the red color. I'm going to put that to a red value of 1. The green value, I'm going to do about 0.6, close to half. And for the blue value, I'm going to go ahead and knock that down. Or maybe I'll put that to about 0.3. Okay, so it's going to create this sort of an orangey type color. It's very similar to the default color from the subdermal scatter layer that was up here. Alright, now for the backscatter weight. And actually, before I change that, let's do render region just so you can see the progression here and how it's changing. Okay, there we go. Now we're getting that yellowish color. So you can see the texture map is now coming through a lot more. Starting to get that yellowish color from the first texture map I showed you that had that sort of yellowish olive drab looking color. Now it's starting to come out that way. There's still graininess, but again, we'll go over that later. We'll fix that later. Now the backscatter weight, I'm going to increase that to 1. And the backscatter radius, I'm actually going to increase that. Take that and increase that to 50. The backscatter depth, I'm not going to adjust just yet. Let me do some render regions here. I'll do render region. Okay, so this is what we have. Now, the subsurface scattering effect is very, very strong when I increase this backscatter radius. So before it was set to 25 and it was a little bit darker. When I increased it, I doubled it to 50, it got brighter. So if you want the subsurface scattering, the backscatter layer to have a stronger effect, you can increase this radius from default. If you want to have a weaker effect, you can decrease the radius. Now, normally for human skin, you don't want this radius to be so big. But for this jellyfish, because it's such a translucent object and it's got this light inside of it, at least based on the reference pictures that I've checked out on the internet, this thing is pretty bright. It's almost like a beacon of light just floating around in the ocean. So I'm going to leave this scatter radius pretty big. Now, the scatter depth, this controls how deep the light can penetrate. So if I take the scatter depth and make it, say, a value of 2. So the default value is 25. Right now I change it to a value of 2. I'll do render region. You'll immediately notice that the subsurface scattering effect is very weak now. It's not as strong as it was before, and it looks very dim. Very little light is actually penetrating the surface or the material of this jellyfish. And this isn't exactly what I want. So I'm going to go with a very strong effect. I'm going to go with 50, just so this subsurface scattering effect is pretty strong. Emphasizes the fact that this is a very translucent object here, this jellyfish. And I did another render region, so here we go. Here it is with a backscatter radius of 50 and a backscatter depth of 50. Okay, you can really see that the light's coming through. It's a very strong effect. In fact, it's a little bit too strong. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the diffuse layers up here, and I'm going to make this stronger. Okay, so how can I make the diffuse layer stronger? The layer that's on top of everything. Well, one thing that I can do is I can come here to the diffuse weight, which you can see is by default a value of 0.3. I'm going to take that and increase it to a value of 1. Okay, and I'm going to go back and do another render region. Now you notice that the subsurface scattering effect is still pretty strong. Increasing the weight of the diffuse layer didn't really help too much. So let's look at something else that we can do. If you notice, we plugged in our texture map to the overall color, and we left this diffuse color at the default, which is sort of this very, very pale blue, looks almost white. Okay, that's the reason why this effect is coming out so strong, because we're telling this thing to have a diffuse color of white. That's not what we want. Instead, what we want is to plug in that same texture map from the overall color into the diffuse color here. So let's open up the Hypershade. Okay, and you can see here that we can't see our network too well here. So I'm going to select the jellyfish material here. I'm going to right click and go to Graph Network, and there we go. Here's our different maps. Okay, now the map down here is the that's the color map. So I'm going to right click on it. I'm going to rename it. That's this yellow map down here. I'm going to call this Diffuse, simply because it makes more sense. If you remember the pale blue sort of dead color here, let's rename it. This was the epidermal layer, so I'm just going to call it epidermal. And the orangey color here, let's rename that. That was the subdermal layer. That really helps to rename that stuff. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this diffuse layer, middle mouse button drag, and drop on top of the jellyfish material here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to plug this into, when this little menu pops up, I'm going to select diffuse color right here. And that's going to plug in that texture into both the diffuse color and the overall color. So let's minimize the hypershade. Now if we look in the attribute editor here for the jellyfish, you'll notice that the diffuse color now has a connection to it. And the connection, if I click on that connection button, you notice that it is in fact this yellow sort of color map. So let me click on this output button here. Okay, and let me go back to the epidermal scatter color map here. I forgot to switch this from quadratic to mipmap, so I'll switch it now to mipmap. And I'll click back on the output button, go back to the attribute editor for the skin shader. Okay, so now that that's set up, let's go ahead and do another render region. But first, let me save this image so I can compare. Do a render region. Okay, so let's compare the two. This is the before and after. It's really having the most effect that it has is on the tentacles down here, where there's a little bit less subsurface scattering because there's less light reaching those tentacles. Okay, so it didn't really have much of an effect here on the main portion of the top of the jellyfish, but that's actually okay. Okay, let me go ahead and say that I'm finished with all these color maps and stuff like that. Let me also apply bump shader. If I go down here to the bump shader slot, I can just click on the checkerboard icon, go to file, and I can plug in a bump node or a bump shader here. And Maya's just giving me a little bit of trouble here. It's giving me some kind of crazy error down there. Let me see. It's basically bugging out over here. Definitely not uncommon for Maya to do. So let me close that. Let me open up the Hypershade here. And I don't want to edit this out of the video simply because this is the kind of stuff that happens with Maya. It's actually pretty normal in Maya. It's pretty scary to say that, but it is. Let me select the jellyfish material here, and I'll click on the input connections here. There's the bump map down there. So I'll open up the attribute editor here. You can see that the bump 2D node is not working. It just simply is blank right here. It's just a bug with Maya. So let me select all these nodes here, the bump nodes, and I'll hit delete to get rid of them. I'll open up the jellyfish material again, and Maya just keeps complaining over and over again about some silliness down here. Let me check that out, see what that is. Okay, apparently Maya is complaining down here that it can't create a UI or user interface object, a form tab 2. So it basically bugged out and decided that it won't be able to create. So it basically bugged out on me and decided to stop functioning correctly. I can't even open up the script editor here. It's not working. So this happens with Maya. It's not uncommon for it to happen. Maya is not exactly the most stable program. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to save my progress here. I'm going to close Maya and open it back up again. If this didn't happen to you, then I'll be right back. If it did happen to you, just go ahead and close Maya, reopen it back up, and make sure to save your progress so you don't lose it. Okay, I'm sorry about that. Not really my fault. Maya just does that from time to time. Kind of have to get used to it. There's no choice there. So I've come back to my scene to save my progress, reopened Maya, and reloaded my scene here. So let's continue where I left off. Let's go ahead and let's open up the attribute editor here for the jellyfish material. Let's go back to bump shader and let's connect that bump shader. So let's go to file, and this time it worked. Just Maya's crazy like that, very unpredictable. But let's go ahead and let's plug in a file node here. And the file we want to plug in, let's go back to the Jellyfish folder, is Jellyfish bump. Okay. And I'm going to take the filter off completely, of course. I'm going to go back to the bump 2D 1 node. And I don't want the bump effect obviously to be 1. That would be overkill. So let's go with 0.1, which will give us a pretty good result. Close that. I'm going to hit this button up here with the rearrange graph button, just to rearrange this correctly. Okay, there we go. Alright, so the bump map is set up and everything. Let me just right click and rename that to bump. I'm a bit of an organizational freak. And there we go. So Jellyfish material looks like it's good to go, at least for now. I'm going to end this video here. And in the next video, we're going to continue to explore some more parameters and features of the skin shader.